On a cold New England night in February of 1949, Father Albert Hughes was going to fight what he believed to be the devil himself, possessing a 14-year-old boy named Robbie Mannheim. Young and inexperienced, Father Hughes had received a blessing few priests could ever dream of, to partake in a battle that even the most pious of holy men fear. That night Father Hughes confessed his sins, lest they be turned against him, lest he die without the Lord's forgiveness. Welcome back to Dark Frontier. You know the 1973 film The Exorcist. It terrified packed theaters the world over when it was released, even sending some audience members into cardiac arrest and fainting spells. But what you might not know is that the true story behind The Exorcist, taken from a book by author William P. Blatty, is deeper and far darker than the pea soup vomiting possession of Reagan McNeil.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
Blatty drew inspiration from two famous exorcisms, one that took place in 1600s France and one in 1940s Maryland, respectively. While the former is mentioned by name in Blatty's text, the French Loudun possessions, as they're called, are a much smaller piece of the story. The true extent of the exorcism of Roland Doe, as it came to be known, wasn't discovered until almost 40 years later, when an exorcist's diary, hidden away and sealed off in an old church hospital room, was revealed to the world. And the contents of that diary are as fascinating as they are disconcerting. Was this young boy's possession a battle between the forces of heaven and hell, or was something less pious and more peculiar happening to this 14-year-old boy? The following are accounts documented by Maryland-based historian Thomas B. Allen, published in his 1993 nonfiction book, Possessed. 1949, Cottage City, Maryland. 14-year-old Robbie Mannheim was an only child with few friends, save for his Aunt Harriet. But Aunt Harriet had several friends of her own. Aunt Harriet was a spiritualist, you see, and spent a lot of time with young Robbie, encouraging him to participate in her regular experiments with a Ouija board. She also instructed Robbie on communicating with spirits via what she called rapping, if he couldn't find access to a Ouija board. Rapping, Aunt Harriet would explain, was a slower method of communication that saw the medium and the spirit talking via a series of knocks and slides against a wall or floor, a secret code between the living and the dead. Well, Aunt Harriet's rapping may have inadvertently brought one of her friends into the realm of the living with grave consequences. On January 15th, 1949, Robbie's parents went out for the evening, leaving the boy and his grandmother alone in the home. Suddenly, the two began to hear a dripping noise. They looked at every faucet in the very well-maintained house and couldn't find the source. Still, the dripping continued. Robbie and his grandmother finally settled into the grandmother's room, where the sound seemed to be emanating, when all of a sudden, there upon the wall, a portrait of Jesus began to violently shake. By the time his parents had returned home, the dripping stopped, only to be replaced by something much more ominous, the scratching of claws. The family called exterminators, pest and rodent control experts who tore up the floors and the walls, but they couldn't find the culprit. The family's only hope, they said, was just to wait for the animal to die. Death did come to the home, and nothing was ever the same. 11 days later, on January 26th, Aunt Harriet dropped dead. As you can imagine, Robbie was destitute and clung to his Ouija board for several hours a day, desperately trying to reconnect with his departed aunt. Then Robbie began hearing footsteps around his bed at night, usually just after he was getting settled in. One night, Robbie's mom and grandmother laid on the bed with him to try to quell the child's fear. a fear they attributed to an overactive imagination and the loss of such a close relative and friend. Then they heard the moving feet too, but noticed something peculiar about them. They seemed to be moving to a beat. Finally, Robbie's mom asked in a trembling voice, "Is that you, Harriet?" Silence set over the room. "If that is you, knock 3 times. The 3 waited until something described as a wave of pressure passed through them simultaneously and to the floor below the bed, where the wooden floorboards let out a single knock, followed by another wave, like the dragging of knuckles. A second knock, another wave, a third knock. Aunt Harriet, or something, was communicating with them. Following the encounter with what they'd believed was Harriet's spirit, the knocking continued, and it wasn't confined to Robbie's home. At school, his desk would violently lurch. Visiting friends and family, several witnesses recount the chairs Robbie would sit in would spin, slide, or be thrust back and forth, despite these things being significantly heavier than a 14-year-old boy could move in such a way. Objects around Robbie would also levitate or be knocked over, without anything to touch or influence them. As the phenomenon continued, the family would send Robbie to psychiatrists and other experts, ranging from the common to the niche. But the greatest revelation would come when they visited their last resort, a Washington, D.C. area pastor at St. Stephen's Evangelical Lutheran Church by the name of Miles Schultz. Schultz was not convinced that Robbie was the victim of some evil ghost, as his family had been led to believe, and as a Lutheran had discarded the traditional Catholic handling of demons in possession, of which Schultz had a tenuous understanding, choosing to battle the devil with prayer as opposed to spectacle, as he would tell a Maryland reporter. Schultz racked his brain, attempting to understand the phenomenon, while Robbie grew ever more despondent. Skeptical of the possession angle, on a theological level, Schultz determined that either Robbie was faking the entire thing, or, if this were the work of the supernatural, it would be a poltergeist, a spirit that haunted a location and exhibited similar signs Robbie and his family had reported, such as throwing clothes and objects, moving furniture, and making noise. Schultz took Robbie to his own home for observation, believing that poltergeist ghosts were territorial and thus wouldn't follow Robbie into Schultz's home. Boy, was he wrong. Schultz put Robbie in one of his guest beds. It began to violently shake. Schultz moved him to a heavy chair to curl up in. The chair fell over backwards. Schultz put him on the floor, nestled on a pallet of blankets. The blankets and Robbie were dragged across the room. Schultz was now as desperate as Robbie and his family for answers. Then, on February 26, 1949, 1 month from the date of Harriet's death, Robbie's condition worsened significantly. Something was seemingly trying to claw its way out of Robbie's body. He would wake up covered in long, bloody gashes and marks. Finally, Schultz told the family, "You have to see a Catholic priest. The Catholics know about things like this." Enter Father E. Albert Hughes, a Catholic priest from a local church near the family's home. Father Hughes was a handsome priest, not yet 30, and described by many as easygoing, but perhaps innocent of the world. In other words, he was green, one who had not been called on for most advanced practices, especially the one that was about to befall him. The Manheim family was desperate, weathered by the month of nightmarish happenings and the slow, torturous condition of their son. During the meeting, Hughes' room was said to have grown frigid cold, and the telephone on his desk began to rattle and shake violently. Before they left, Hughes gave the family a bottle of holy water with instructions to a rite, and told them he would pray for them heavily. That went about as well as you would expect. Hughes got the call the next morning from the family, who told him that the holy water bottle had been smashed after being flung from the boy's nightstand. In the middle of their call, The family's telephone was ripped from the wall and thrown to the floor. Hughes apparently had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. He rushed to the family's home, where he confronted the boy, who spoke to him in advanced Latin, asking one simple question that would change the fate of the two forever. "Who are you?" "Oh, priest of Christ, you know that I am the devil. Why do you keep bothering me?" Hughes knew now what had to be done. Upon receiving ordination from the church, every new Catholic priest is given a specific set of tools steeped in tradition dating back thousands of years. Among these tools is one in particular, an ancient tome that few priests ever need open, the Rituale Romanum, the Roman ritual, the official Catholic text on demonic possession and exorcism. Father Hughes knew he would need this ancient weapon to do battle against evil itself. The Latin text, largely unchanged since its publication in 1614, dedicates 58 pages specifically to exorcism rituals. In the text, the Rituale Romanum lays out the warning signs, the symptoms of demonic possession, to present to a Catholic ordinary, a judge in cases of exorcism. The text describes the warning signs as the facility to speak in strange tongues or understand them when spoken by others, as well as divulging future and hidden events, and a display of power beyond the subject's age or understanding. Hughes called upon his ordinary, the Archbishop of Washington, the Most Reverend Patrick A. O'Boyle, a protege of the most powerful Catholic figure in the United States, Francis Cardinal Spellman, the Archbishop of New York. O'Boyle was a powerful figure, but his experiences up until that point had more to do with Catholic bureaucracy and administrative matters than anything so arcane. Hesitant, O'Boyle granted Hughes the authority to perform the exorcism. Young, brash, and eager, Hughes was still cautious enough to perform a confession before the rite, in order to protect him from Satan's power to exploit a sinful heart. It was a common practice for holy men to receive blessings of confession before such tasks, as knights of old would on the eve of a great battle, and this would be the greatest battle of all for Hughes. Father Hughes had Robbie admitted to an area hospital at Georgetown University, where the first battle against the demon possessing the young boy would be fought and lost. While historical and witness accounts differ wildly on what happened to Hughes and the young boy that night, the end result is known. Whatever happened in that room left Father Hughes permanently injured in one arm, and led him to forsake the St. James Church and seemingly disappear for the rest of his days, seen in glimpses at churches throughout the area, visibly shaken and ultimately defeated. While the specifics of Hughes' battle with Robbie's possession is largely based on second and third-hand reports, what happened in St. Louis, Missouri was chronicled by the case's next exorcist in a personal diary that was secretly locked away in the Jesuit and Archdiocesan archives for over 40 years. If you feel your hand moving on its own, hovering over that subscribe button, don't worry. You're not possessed. You're just entering the dark frontier. Click it. Click it.
Click it.
It was now March 1949. The 2 months of terror that Robbie and his family had lived through was about to get much worse. Robbie's mother, a Missouri native, had family in St. Louis and believed the chain and scenery could help Robbie's disposition. After all, it certainly couldn't hurt, could it? The Manheim family, divided between Lutherans and Catholics, took Robbie and his parents under their roof in turns. First was his mother's Lutheran family, where Robbie lasted only a couple of days before his convulsions would return and the scratching noises would reappear. Next was Robbie's father's side of the family, Catholic. Within a week, the demonic possession returned, this time impacting his Uncle George and Aunt Catherine, as well as Robbie's cousins, Marty, Billy, and Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a student at St. Louis University, a Jesuit institution, and when all seemed lost, she sought her teacher, Father Raymond J. Bishop. Bishop assured Elizabeth that he would pray for Robbie and visit the family's home to verify this phenomenon for himself. What happened between Father Bishop and Robbie Manaheim over the next 40 days was documented in Father Bishop's unearthed diary. It is through Father Bishop's diary that Robbie's story is given dates and witnesses. Father Bishop's case background confirms that over 14 people were allegedly witness to Robbie's outbursts and possession since January 15th when the incidents began. These witnesses included Robbie's family, as well as 2 Lutheran ministers and a physiatrist. The physiatrist did not believe the phenomena. Boy was quite normal. Robbie was irritated by the questions and procedures. A physician gave Robbie a complete physical checkup and found him to be a normal boy, but somewhat high-strung. A spiritualist was called in to use his formula for ridding people of spirits, but he had no success. Father Bishop's diary also reveals a very interesting detail. Father Hughes, the first priest, allegedly never met Robbie in person. He did not meet the boy in person. Father Hughes was seeking permission from the Archbishop for an exorcism about the same time the Manaheim family was about to go to St. Louis. Consequently, he was unable to proceed with his plan. This seemingly inconsequential addition to the story from Bishop would be the first of many points Bishop would make that would either accidentally or intentionally harm the exorcism's credibility. Arriving in St. Louis, Father Bishop notes that Robbie's possession was witnessed by 2 aunts of the boy, 4 uncles, and 4 cousins. Father Bishop then reveals that after he was approached by Elizabeth, he consulted with colleague Father Kenny and the president of St. Louis University, Father Paul C. Reinert. Father Bishop would visit the family on Wednesday, March 9th, 1949. He blessed the house and placed a second-class relic of St. Margaret Mary. A second-class relic, as classified by the Catholic Church, are items like rosaries, Bibles, clothes, and anything worn or used by a saint during his or her lifetime. After pinning the relic to Robbie's pillow, Bishop reported that the bed began to shake immediately, but the shaking subsided after he sprinkled holy water upon it in the form of a cross. After Bishop left the room, Robbie cried out in pain. Zigzag scratches had appeared upon his stomach. There were 6 witnesses in the room when Father Bishop left. The next day, the relic was thrown to the floor. That Friday, March 11th, the battle for Robbie's soul would begin. Father Bishop and a pastor named Father Bodern returned to Robbie's home with a holy weapon, a first-class relic of Saint Francis Xavier, a piece of the saint's forearm bone, as well as a crucifix made of first-class relic bone fragments collected from several North American martyrs. After blessing Robbie, the group left the room. They weren't gone long before Robbie screamed. Some of the objects had been thrown across the room, and a cross mark was scratched on Robbie's forearm, almost the exact same spot the relic of Xavier had come from. Fathers Bishop and Bodern moved on to the second stage of the exorcism. Their physical weapons were only part of the arsenal that night, as they came armed with something many Catholics believed to be far more powerful: a novena prayer. The novena prayers are the highest echelon of prayers in the Catholic canon, and that night they read the novena of St. Francis Xavier himself. As the holy men went downstairs, another crash was heard from Robbie's room, where he and his mother lay in bed together. The bottle of holy water was thrown. A bookcase was moved, and a stool was dragged across the room and toppled over. The next day, Bishop recounts that the bookcase was moved again just before their arrival, but notes that it was moved with precision. The books and case would weigh more than 50 pounds. Bishop and Bodern prayed over Robbie from midnight until 3 a.m. There were no other incidents that night. On March 16th, Father William S. Bodern received permission from Archbishop Joseph E. Ritter to read the prayer of exorcism from the Rituale Romanum. In the room were Father Bodern, Father Bishop, Robbie's mother and father, as well as Robbie's aunt and uncle with whom the family was staying. Robbie's hands were visible above the covers, and he lay completely still as Bodern began the ritual. On the first Precipio, there was immediate action, Bishop wrote. Precipio is uttered during the prayer as an attempt to identify the being possessing the victim. 3 large parallel bars were scratched on the boy's stomach, then his legs, thighs, back, chest, face, and throat. Robbie began to scream as blood welled from the scratches. Precipio, Precipio, Father Bodern kept demanding. Show yourself. And show itself the beast did. A picture of the devil appeared on Robbie's right leg, and the word hell was imprinted on his chest. The devil was portrayed in red, his arms held above his head, and seemed to be webbed, giving the hideous appearance of a bat. Bodern then asked, how many demons? 1 scratch mark appeared. The scratching and thrashing subsided as the prayers continued and Robbie eventually passed out from exhaustion. Through the night, Bishop and Bodern continued to pray, reciting the ritual until they got to St. Michael. Upon uttering his name, Robbie's condition would worsen dramatically. In the Bible, Michael the Archangel is the protector of the Catholic Church and the warrior of heaven. That night, it was his name that sent Robbie and his passenger into a frenzy. When the prayers to Michael had begun, Robbie began sparring. He struck the headboard of his bed with strong blows from his fist, then began punching the pillows with more than ordinary force. This was, according to the family, the most violent and terrifying Robbie had been since January. After he was doused in holy water, Robbie told the holy men of what he was doing and what he saw. He said he was fighting a huge red devil, slimy and powerful. The devil was trying to prevent him from getting through the iron gates of a pit 100 feet deep and very hot. Robbie wanted to fight the devil and thought he was strong enough. He was surrounded by smaller demons as well. Through the night until 5 a.m., the men had to restrain Robbie, whose violent outbursts grew more and more severe as the prayers continued. Bishop noted that his strength was beyond the ordinary strength of a boy. By the time the sun came up, Robbie was so limp and weak, he could not even hold his head up for a drink of water. At the strike of 7, he finally passed out. Bishop noted that Robbie slept until 1 p.m. and was able to eat a full meal before joining his family for a game of Monopoly. The exorcism continued for the next 5 days, with Robbie's outbursts becoming more and more dangerous. Biting, urination, screaming, twisting. On Monday, March 21st, Robbie was transferred to a hospital to give his family a break and to give the exorcism party more privacy. He would stay there for 3 days until March 23rd, when he would be transferred to the St. Francis Xavier College Church Rectory. On March 31st, Robbie's condition worsened. That's when he began to write, or rather something inside him began to write. I will stay 10 days. I am the devil himself. He also wrote, all that mangle with me will die a terrible death. On April 1st, the exorcists had decided to baptize Robbie, hoping that this act would be the Hail Mary they needed after all else had failed. Robbie clawed and screamed on the way to the church, and even attempted to yank the steering wheel away from his uncle in an attempt to crash the car so they couldn't make it to the church. Given Robbie's violent state, the baptism was attempted, but it failed. The prayer continued in vain. Monday, April 18th, 1949. At just over 4 months, Robbie's possession was taking its toll on the boy, as well as his family and the holy men involved. At 8 o'clock that morning, during a communion, Robbie was seized by the devil, who stated that only one of the demons that presided in him was gone, and that 9 more remained. Throughout the day, the exorcists worked diligently in prayer through Robbie's fits, and finally, as Bishop noted, there seemed to be a light at the end of the tunnel. Every time Robbie would lapse into the control of his possession, he would re-emerge in prayer, both in English and in Latin. Covered in crosses and relics, the cycle continued, with Robbie seemingly becoming more and more adept as they did. Finally, Bishop said Robbie was possessed by something else. Something divine. At 10:45 p.m. that night, Robbie was once again taken by seizure. But instead of continuing to thrash, scream, and curse, he spoke calmly. "Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael, and I command you, Satan and the other devil spirits, to leave this body in the name of Dominus, immediately, now." Bodern, Bishop, an accomplice named Father O'Flaherty, and brothers of the Catholic Church were in the room for this, as they had been the entire day of battle. Perhaps, Bishop would write in his journal, this was the fight to the finish. The most violent physical outburst of the entire saga happened here, Bishop noted, and exhausted everyone in the room as they attempted to restrain Robbie. After 10 minutes of violence, Robbie came to and screamed one last time, proclaiming, "He's gone!" Robbie lay in bed, his limbs weak, his mind broken, much as the holy men and exorcists in the room with him. One can imagine the ragged breathing, the wincing at bruises and scratches, the dry throats, the tense muscles. They had just done battle with the devil himself, and Robbie had been in the middle of a fight between the most divine of heaven and the most ruthless of hell. His very mind had been a battleground for months. Robbie, shakily, explained what he had seen during these convulsions. A brilliant white light, and in that light stood a beautiful man with wavy hair that blew in the breeze. He wore a white robe, and the material gave the impression of scales. In his right hand was a fiery sword. His left hand pointed down into a pit. Robbie saw the devil standing in that cave, and felt the heat from the flames of hell. At first, the devil fought and laughed, but the angel turned to Robbie and spoke only one word, Dominus. The devil and his demons were engulfed in the pit, where bars appeared to seal them in. The bars read, Spite. As they all disappeared, Robbie felt a tugging in his stomach, then a snapping. Then, for the first time since January 15th, 1949, he felt relaxation. As Robbie spoke, the clock struck 11 p.m. It was all, finally, over. Bishop concluded his diary, noting that Robbie and his family had successfully converted to Catholicism. On November 8, 1970, about 20 years later, Bishop's final entry, added in a separate diary, apparently notes that he had kept tabs on Robbie. Verified residence with telephone operator. He has an unlisted phone number. None of the information in this video, however, would likely have ever been known if not for a twist of fate itself. The diary was sealed away, but the nature of Robbie's possession and the answer for why it happened were all shrouded in mystery until years later. The room where Robbie's exorcism took place, at the Alexian Brothers Psychiatric Ward on the St. Louis University campus, was sealed off after that Easter Monday encounter in 1949. The room was said to have been tainted by the devil itself. Bishop left his diary in that room, and the Catholic Church sealed away all records and reports of Robbie's possession and exorcism. A janitor on the college campus in the 1940s would later speak of the room during a 2014 reading at the university, telling St. Louis Magazine that every year they had to repaint the room because the paint wouldn't stick to the walls. In August 1949, Bill Brinkley of the Washington Post published an article titled "Priest Frees Mount Rainier Boy Held in Devil's Grip." Brinkley covered the exorcism as relayed to him by Catholic sources. This article would in turn inspire a Georgetown University student by the name of William Peter Blatty in 1950 to begin work on a novel by the name of The Exorcist. The novel was published in 1971 and worked into a film by 1973. In 1978, when the Alexian brothers' psychiatric ward was demolished, Bishop's diary was found locked in a drawer in the very room where everything had allegedly transpired. Reverend Walter Holleran, who had assisted during the exorcism, had offered author Thomas Allen a copy of the diary, while Allen was doing research for his novel, Possessed: The True Story of an Exorcism. Through all the coverage of The Exorcist since the early 1970s, two questions above all others have lingered. The first asks, whatever happened to Robbie? In 2020, Ronald Edwin Hunkler died a month before his 86th birthday. A NASA engineer who worked for the Apollo space missions in the 1960s, and on the patent for a special technology that helped space shuttle panels withstand the extreme heat of atmospheric re-entry. Hunkler kept one secret from his coworkers. He was Robbie Mannheim. He was the boy possessed. Hunkler retired from NASA in 2001 after spending 40 years with the organization. In the fall of 2021, journalist J.D. Sword for the Skeptical Inquirer, a magazine long devoted to the scrutiny and examination of sensational events, pored over breadcrumbs laid out in interviews and books dating back to the 1970s to uncover the true identity of Robbie Mannheim. When the story broke, it was covered by nearly every website and publication imaginable. A piece from the New York Post interviewed one of Hunkler's female companions. She stated that Ronald Hunkler lived in constant fear of anyone finding out he was the inspiration for The Exorcist. On Halloween, we would always leave the house because he figured someone would find out who he was and would come over to bother, never letting him have any peace. Of course, the most interesting piece in this article came from Ronald, or Robbie, himself. He said he wasn't possessed. It was all concocted. He said he was just a bad boy. Like any story, Robbie's has faced a good deal of scrutiny over the years. Was he acting out for attention? Or was he a pawn in someone else's game? Perhaps a play for buried treasure left behind by his eccentric aunt. Then what of the witnesses, all of the holy men who chronicled and witnessed these events as they happened? In developing the film adaptation of Blatty's novel, director William Friedkin consulted with former APA president and award-winning researcher Dr. Stanley Krippner, who would later provide the preface for the 2018 nonfiction book Diabolical Possession and the Case Behind the Exorcist. The book was written by the director of the Institute of Medicine and Advanced Behavior Technologies at the Hospital Poliplaza Medica in Mexico, Dr. Sergio A. Rueda, Ph.D. The book acted as a thorough deep dive into the many psychological aspects of Robbie and the witnesses to his possession. Rueda suggests that part of what has retroactively made Robbie's case so real was what Blatty had written in his novel. Blatty, a devout Catholic since his childhood, stressed that the novel was inspired by real events and considers it to be, in his words, an apostolic work or something attributed to the apostles of Christ. In Rueda's text, he postulates that the connection between Robbie's aunt and the strange happenings was imagined, as two of the key witnesses to the original events that began that January were Robbie himself, who was close to his aunt, and his mother. Rueda also notes that the witnesses in the early days of the case were all devout religious followers, and any inconsistencies or the suggestion that Robbie himself was solely responsible for the scratching, screaming, and bed shaking were dismissed for the desire to witness a tangible battle and reinforcement of religious power. In Bishop's diary, which has remained a crucial piece of the mystery, regardless of interpretation or belief, one paragraph in the entry for Friday, March 11th, 1949, stands out, more so than the sensational accounts of a battle between the ultimate forces of good and evil. It suggested a financial motive behind the possession. The 5 people in the home decided to ask questions of the spirit. There is some question about an amount of money which was concealed by Aunt Harriet before she died. Through many different questions, it seemed that the map which would locate the money, hidden in the metal strongbox, would be found in the attic of redacted home. but only Robbie's father could find it. When the father's name was suggested, the bed shook violently. Further questioning revealed that the money was for Redacted, the daughter of Redacted. Whenever the family wanted the bed shaking to stop, the family called for the aunt, and the bed stopped as though she was listening. On the night that Aunt Harriet died, she told everyone to go to bed at 10 p.m., and she died between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. the following morning. The bed shaking and noise always ceases by 3 a.m. Could this lockbox be a battle of inheritance between Robbie's mother and extended family that he was inspired to partake in by his believer mother? In an article for the Skeptical Inquirer, author J.D. Sword notes that Bishop's diary reflected that Bishop relied on second-hand information for whatever had transpired between January 15th and March 9th, when he was officially brought onto the case. Researcher and author Mark Upsasnik, who wrote the 2016 book The Real Story Behind the Exorcist, told Sword that he believed Robbie was just a spoiled kid vying for attention. Similarly, Rueda had reported that his communication with a friend of the family revealed that the family's dynamics were more curious than they appeared. Robbie's father spoiled the boy, while the mother was both strict and superstitious, entertaining his and his aunt's eccentricities. She, as it turns out, was one of Robbie's most adamant witnesses during the possession case. Thomas Allen, who wrote Possessed, told the St. Louis Magazine during the aforementioned 2014 article that even he was divided on the true nature of the story, and so too was witness Father Halloran. Exorcism brings you to a very fine and precise point, Allen told the magazine about the appeal of exorcism as a real event to reinforce the beliefs of good and evil. There's one kid, he's in bed and it's an evil event, and here's a priest that's going to end it. He stated that Halloran was torn between his spiritual mind and his rational mind, and what they both wanted to believe. But, curiously, just before the real-life Ronald Hunkeler died, something truly inexplicable happened. Hunkeler's companion told the New York Post that just before Ronald died, a Catholic priest had shown up mysteriously to the house, without being called for by Ronald or by her. I have no idea how the father knew to come, she said, but he came to the home and performed the last rites. The father got Ron to heaven, she said. He's in heaven with God now. This is the most complex story I've ever covered. Who was the mysterious priest, and how did he know to come? Was Ronald's story an elaborate hoax? If so, why did the Catholic Church bury it in secrecy? Were they just tying up loose ends? After all, the devil's in the details. Hi. If you haven't noticed, Dark Frontier is a small channel. This means I can still read and reply to every comment, and it makes a big difference when I can hear from you guys, what you like and what you don't about our videos. Thank you for watching Dark Frontier.